Hello subscribers, I recently watched a debate between Inspiring Philosophy and someone called G-Man on the age of the Patriarchs. Did they really live to 900 years old, according to the Bible? And I was thoroughly disappointed in that dumpster fire. The challenges Inspiring Philosophy was putting forth were easy to refute, but G-Man, all he did was he just kept reading the verse that said Adam lived to 930 years. And that was his entire argument. It was painful to watch. He didn't deal with any of the challenges that IP put forward, and he didn't challenge IP himself, really. So I decided to deal with these challenges myself, since G-Man could not do it, and he should not be debating people, from what I've seen. But these are real easy challenges to deal with, so in this video, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So, IP's first challenge is, why is Abraham called an old man if he died much younger than his ancestors? That's easy, because he was an old man. According to Inspiring Philosophy's logic, if there's somebody older than you, you cannot be considered old.
If the ages are literal, Shem, Arphaxad, Sela, and Eber were all his contemporaries, and therefore he was not an old man.
So in other words, when Betty Wright died at 90, you can't say she died an old woman, because there was a 95-year-old somewhere out there. Somewhere out there, there's a 95-year-old person. Therefore, Betty White could not have been old when she died. IP will want to say that because Eber is so much older than Abraham, at his age can't be that old. But not according to Abraham. So the question IP needs to answer is, what was the average age of the time?
The Bible doesn't say, it doesn't care.
And there is, of course, another problem that IP has with his own question, but we'll get to that later. But for now, who's to say Eber was the average lifespan? Eber may have been old in Eber's day, but by the time Abraham comes around, the average person's living to 100 or 80. Where's your evidence that the average is higher? Next, IP asks, why is Abraham laughing at the prospect of having a child at age 100? First of all, he's not laughing at just him having a child at age 99, but also Sarah at the age of 90. Men do not go through menopause. Abraham's laughter is at the idea of Sarah having a child, and he includes himself in the statement because it's synonymous parallelism. And you can't say it's not literal because it's synonymous parallelism, because in the same chapter, just a few verses down, it reconfirms that Abraham was 99 years old when this happened. So it reaffirms the literal age of Abraham being 99. Furthermore, Ishmael, who Abraham did not laugh at the birth of, was born when Abraham was 86. So there's an inconsistency in IP's view here. If Abraham really thought it was a miracle to have a child born at 99, why wouldn't he still think it's a miracle at 86? That's not a large amount of time. And lastly, if Abraham's age was symbolic, then why was he laughing? IP's got the same problem. It's actually worse for IP, because it makes even less sense. If Abraham's age is merely symbolic and he's not actually an old man, then why is he laughing at the prospect of having a child? If IP says Abraham's age and Sarah's age is literal, well then he has to answer, why is Terah's age symbolic? What's with the arbitrary line drawing of this person's age is symbolic and this person's age is literal? Next, IP argues that Jacob fathered children in his 90s, and that was not miraculous. Well, first, says who? Who says it was not miraculous? If he says the Bible says it wasn't miraculous, then he's just arguing from silence. Just because it's not recorded as a miracle doesn't mean it wasn't. But I would argue it's not. Men do not go through menopause. It is not a miracle for a 90-year-old to father a child if the wife is young enough. Because consistently, IP will neglect the woman. When he complains that Abraham should think it's normal for people to have children because his father had children at an old age, he neglects to mention how old Abraham's mother was.
The Bible doesn't say, it doesn't care.
we don't know. And then with Jacob, he doesn't mention how old Rachel is.
The Bible doesn't say, it doesn't care.
Again, we don't know. She could have been 40 when Joseph was born. So Jacob was 70 when he met Rachel. So she could have been 20, and then 20 years later, Joseph is born, and she's 40. Not gone through menopause yet. So it would be up to IP to prove that she was older than that. But even if he could prove that Rachel had gone through menopause by the time Joseph is born, it still doesn't mean anything. It could have been a miracle that just wasn't recorded as miraculous. However, an argument could be made that it was recorded as miraculous, because it is stated, and I forget exactly where it's stated, but it is stated that Jacob loved Joseph because he was the child of his old age. That may not be an explicit statement of a miracle, but it is slightly implicit. The next one is, why do dates and ages vary between manuscript traditions? So IP offers this chart to show the difference between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, and I guess the Septuagint again, based on another slide he shows. I'll get into that later. But he says there's differences because Jared in Masoretic is 162 at age of firstborn and only 62 at age of firstborn in the Septuagint. So their death age is 120 years off. But here's the thing, what's the point of this? Adam's age of death is 930, and then the Septuagint, age of death 930, and the second Septuagint, age of death 930. They all agree. The differences are very minor, especially for the topic of the debate that it was. The debate topic was, did the patriarchs live these vast ages? And all of these agree they did. So it really doesn't help IP's case at all. And this brings up the question for IP, which one does he believe is correct? Because surely not all these variants can be correct. So which one is it? I go with King James. I'm pretty sure that's Masoretic, but it doesn't affect my case if Inspiring Philosophy tries to argue Septuagint is correct. The age of the patriarchs would still be over 900 for most of them. So then we have this chart he showed, which shows that Eber outlived Abraham in the Masoretic text. What this chart doesn't show is whether Abraham actually knew Eber. He's a few generations removed. But more importantly, the Septuagint dates, and this is why I said this was LXX was Septuagint too, because he's got Septuagint and LXX as the same. Not sure what he's saying with that. But, and this would be another problem with IP's case, is if you use the Septuagint dates, his problem of Eber being older or living longer than Abraham just fades away. So does IP use the Septuagint date? Does he believe the Septuagint is the correct dates? He doesn't say. This makes his a lot of his argument very disingenuous, because on the one hand, he's arguing that the Masoretic and Septuagint don't agree, therefore you can't trust either of them, but all his arguments rely on the Masoretic reading, when it would seem like he would agree with the Septuagint reading. But instead of trying to argue that the Septuagint reading is more accurate, and then going from there, he tries to use it the way an atheist would argue against Pascal's wager. Specifically, well, there's so many different religions, you can't apply them all, or something like that. I'm obviously terrible at articulating the point that's in my head. The next argument is, why does the cultural context suggest numbers were used for symbolic purposes? And he gives some examples. I didn't take any pictures of those, though, but one example was some ancient king, not recorded in the Bible, saying he built some sort of bath, I think, 16,000 cubits, the number of his name.
So Sargon II of Assyria said, I built the circumference of the city wall 16,283, the number of my name.
But even a superficial reading could tell you that he built the thing to the 16,000 cubits. His basis for the 16,000 cubits was the number of his name. He's not lying about the amount of cubits and just saying it's the number of his name. He used the number of his name as a basis for how big he was going to make it. So does the cultural context suggest numbers were used for symbolic purposes? Maybe, but that doesn't mean they weren't real. And lastly, why do special formulas and symbolic numbers frequently show up in text? So now IP is getting into numerology. So first off, he ended up fudging some numbers to make his point. Over here we see all these ages add up to 12,600. That's accurate, but he cites this as being a reference to Revelations. Well, let's go look at Revelations. So the first one is Revelation 11:3, and I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,203 days. Closed in sackcloth. And second one, Revelation 12:6. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, and they should feed her there 1,203 days. 1,260 days, not 12,600. That is a very big difference. And because G-Man was so focused on not answering Inspiring Philosophy's challenges, he completely missed this misreading of Revelation. But also, another point is that, does this number still work in the Septuagint? Because he's using Masoretic numbers, but would you still get to 12,600 in the Septuagint? I don't suppose it matters, since apparently there's no real significance to this number. The two verses he cites to make it significant are a completely different number, or at least divided by 10. So next, he tries to find a formula with the ages, saying they're all divisible by 5 up to Noah. But if they're not divisible by 5, we can just minus 7 to make them divisible by 5. And if they're still not divisible by 5, we can just keep minusing 7 until they're divisible by 5. How is this formula derived? Well, obviously, if you can get any number to be divisible by 5 if you just keep minusing 7. If he could have done this with only minusing 7 once, it might have been an okay point. But Methuselah breaks his argument, because right back here at the end, on the total lifespan, he has to minus 7 twice. I could just get any result. If I can just minus 7 as many times as I want, I could get any result I want. I could also just add 3 anytime I want and get numbers divisible by 5. Allow me to show you. This is a challenge IP put out saying you cannot find a formula here.
If you could find any formula, the challenge is to find a formula in this, and I would argue that cannot be done.
But I can. So here we go. Just add 3. If it's not divisible by 5, add 3. If it's still not, just keep adding 3s until they're divisible by 5. This is the same formula IP used on his other one. I'm just using his own formula and coming up with the same answer. Everything's divisible by 5. Imagine that. And you can literally do this with any number. They will all be divisible by 5 in, at the most, adding 4 3s, or minusing 7 4 times, if there's room, because we don't want to go into the negative numbers, because that would be confusing. But yeah, literally any number can be divisible by 5 if you just add 3 enough times, and there's the formula that we got from Inspiring Philosophy. So that's every issue that Inspiring Philosophy brought up. But now let me throw a couple more wrenches into the works. Even if he could prove that the ages were symbolic, it would not show that they were not also literal. If that were the case, then Inspiring Philosophy would have to believe that Joseph was not a real person, because Joseph is a type of Christ. He is symbolic of Christ. But if being symbolic means you can't also be literal, then Joseph wouldn't have existed. And Abraham would have never offered up Isaac on the mountain. That event would not have happened if things that were symbolic of other things could not also be literal. And IP has not really done a good job proving that they are symbolic, let alone proving that they're not literal. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Years in the Hebrew is shane or shana, from a year, as a revolution of time. This is not, as inspiring philosophy argued, just a number. It's not saying the number of Adam is 930. It says he lived 930 years. One of the things IP said is, my wife could be a 10, that doesn't mean she's 10 years old. But if you say your wife is 10 years, or that your wife lived 10 years, that would be especially weird, and she died, then it would mean that she's 10 years old. This is not saying Adam was a 10, or was a 930, and it's not saying his number is 930. It's saying he lived 930 years. You're going to have to do a lot better if you want to say that is symbolic of something. So now I'm going to offer my own challenge to inspiring philosophy. What was the average lifespan of people in Abraham's day? And what was the average lifespan of people in Eber's day?
The Bible doesn't say, it doesn't care.
If Abraham and Sarah's age is symbolic, why would he laugh at the idea of Sarah conceiving at an old age? And along that same line, how are you deciding when an age is literal and when it's symbolic? Who is the first person mentioned in the Bible who you feel is the first person with a literal age? And why is that person literal and everyone before him symbolic? What marks the change? How old was Rachel when she gave birth to Joseph? She could have been 40, at which point it's not a miracle. So how old was she? Which manuscript tradition do you subscribe to? If you subscribe to the Septuagint, then all your arguments for Eber outliving Abraham just fall away. And if you actually believe the Masoretic text, then why bother bringing it up in the first place? What symbolic meaning are the ages supposed to have? And why should that symbolic meaning demand no literal meaning as well? So that's my challenge to IP. I'm betting he will not take it up because he won't actually know about this video. And even if he does know about the video, he'll probably ignore me because I only have somewhere around 60 subscribers. But that's it for this video.